What's up? Welcome to another OMNI Focus Fitness video. Today we're going to be discussing if it is possible to build muscle while in a caloric deficit. So while losing fat, is it possible for you to be gaining muscle? A little backstory to that is it used to be assumed, or it is assumed, largely now even, that if you're in a caloric deficit that your body doesn't have the appropriate resources to appropriate and give to muscle production, which is a costly process. And it makes sense, it makes rational sense, and that's what's kind of just been assumed. We don't have a ton of research on the subject, but there has been some research, and we're going to go ahead and break that research down in this video and explain why or why not we can or cannot build muscle while we're in a caloric deficit, as well as, if it is possible, how to achieve that possibility. And of course, just a quick stipulation, this is for specifically natural lifters, so we're not talking about enhanced. We're not talking about enhanced individuals. All right, so without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Okay, so I may have mentioned that this topic is a little controversial. If I haven't, I'm announcing it now. It's a bit controversial because there actually isn't a whole lot of research on this topic. And if somebody were to come up to you and ask you, can you build muscle while in a caloric deficit? I feel like most people would probably say no if they understand any level of physiology. And that makes sense. I mean, that's understandable. I think most people kind of assume that you can maintain muscle because we have a lot of studies saying, okay, you can definitely maintain muscle while in a caloric deficit. But we don't have very many that look at specifically at specific parameters, at specific populations in regards to, can we gain muscle during a caloric deficit? So you'll usually get the answer of no, you cannot gain muscle during a caloric deficit. However, that is a generalized statement and is not necessarily accurate for all populations. While generally you could sometimes use a generalized statement to attribute to a mass population, that isn't necessarily always the case. So in this case, we have to break it down into what I broke down into 3 different categories. And one of those is overweight and obese individuals. So overweight and obese individuals, there are many, many studies on this. And it's been shown that in many of those studies that have actually looked at this, and some of them have specifically looked at this, is that it is possible for a person to gain muscle, or at least change their body composition to a point where they have more muscle, and drop fat. Also, going along with that, it seems to be easier for a person who is obese or severely overweight to not only drop weight, but also, or drop fat, but also gain a little bit of muscle. There's a study where people only consumed 800 calories and had definitely far too low of protein intake in those 800 calories, and still they were able to favorably increase or have hypertrophy in their musculature while dropping a decent amount of fat. So if you are, the more overweight you are, I guess you could say the less strict one's diet needs to be, as long as you're still in that caloric deficit, you could still technically gain some muscle, even if you're not as strict as some of the other groups might have to be. Might have to be. Have to be. Just, okay, never mind. Okay, so overweight, obese, yes, you can gain muscle, and I'll go over how much in the next section, but you can gain muscle during a caloric deficit. And the next one is athletes and advanced lifters, and I kind of group those together because they're almost the same thing. Almost. Close enough. Here, things get a little muddier. Now, there was a study that was, somebody introduced it to me. I believe it was Greg Nuckols who introduced it. He posted it on Facebook or something like that, and I ended up reading it, kind of making my own analysis of it. And then I found another study that came out of that same lab that basically said the same thing as their previous study. So there are two studies that have come out looking at athletes specifically, and if they can gain muscle while reducing their body fat or changing their body composition, so kind of a body recomp. And both those studies concluded that yes, it is possible. Now, before we all just jump to the conclusion that all athletes can suddenly gain muscle while reducing fat, first of all, it's going to be extremely difficult. And I'll go over that again a little bit later in the video. But just because one study says it, or maybe two studies, specifically if they come out of the same lab, does not necessarily mean that it's 100% foolproof. Definitely, yes, athletes, advanced lifters can gain muscle during a caloric deficit. So what we really need to do is have a healthy amount of skepticism and be able to wait for kind of the reproduction of that study or a similar study being done to kind of substantiate what one or two studies out of a particular lab have already done. So for the time being, we can say that yes, tentatively, it is possible that even advanced lifters could gain a little bit of muscle while reducing their body fat. And the last, I guess, population that I kind of broke it up into is beginners, novice lifters. And for this one, it seems like the fitness community, the physiology community kind of just assumes that yes, beginners can recomposition their body quite easily. It happens quite often, and this may very well be the case. There aren't many studies in this case, but between the studies for obesity and overweight individuals and the 1 to 2 studies on athletes and advanced lifters, it's plausible to assume that a novice lifter, specifically since a lot of those obesity studies and overweight studies were done on beginner lifters, that it's plausible to assume that what applies to both of those extremes on one end and the other end, that beginner lifters do indeed gain some muscle while reducing fat, so they can body recomposition themselves. That said, again, there's no specific study saying that. I'm just kind of extrapolating based off of the information off the studies that I've read. Although, again, many experts, many people out there will, of course, boldly claim that it is perfectly possible for a beginner. And when we're talking about beginner, we're talking somebody that's lifted for, seriously lifted for less than a year, for example. I think that's a pretty safe assumption. Okay, moving on. Alright, so you probably want to know a little more information. You don't want to just know if it's possible or not, which we're leaning towards yes, it is possible, but you also kind of want to know how much muscle can you gain within a certain given period of time. Well, again, we are a little limited because most of the data comes from obese and overweight individuals who might have a physiological advantage, at least at the beginning of their losing weight period, because their body is so overfat, has an abundance of energy that it can use, which would presumably I guess theoretically, if we think about it, it might help them be able to preserve and gain a little bit of muscle. So you have to take this with a little bit of grain of salt, but in general, the studies that I've looked at, you can expect to gain between 1 and 2 pounds of lean mass. So I'm not talking exclusively muscle here. I just want to make that clear. We're talking about lean body tissue in a period of several months. So the process is going to be very slow. It's going to be slower than if you were in a caloric surplus, of course, like if you were in a lean gaining phase or bulking phase or whatever you want to call it. It's going to be a lot slower, but that's what those studies, again, a little bit skewed and might not necessarily apply to you. It's very possible you'd gain a lot less than that, like maybe half a pound in many months. Okay, so you want to make sure that you plug in all the variables and make everything as optimal as possible for you to continue losing weight while increasing your muscle mass, because you don't want to lose them gains, right? Okay, so here are 3 things that each study I think all of these studies ended up doing because, well, it made perfect sense. So the first thing is having a low deficit, so a small deficit. You don't want to have an extreme deficit, and that is more applicable for lean individuals. So if we're talking about beginners that are normal weight, or if we're talking about advanced lifters, athletes, you'd want to start off with as small a deficit as possible while still losing weight. That way your body isn't under a massive amount of stress. That does not necessarily apply for people who are obese. And so basically, if we have a spectrum of the more obese you are, the closer you are to obese in terms of body fat. We're not talking about BMI here, because again, BMI can really throw those results off. Like, for example, I am overweight, okay? I don't look overweight, but I am severely overweight. I'm close to obese. So we're not basing this off of BMI. We're talking about body fat percentage. So if you are severely obese, you could be in a more severe caloric deficit and still gain muscle. Again, supposedly assuming that's because you have a high amount of energy that's already stored on your body, and your body's trying to get rid of that. That is just pure, just thinking about it. It's possible that it could be a different mechanism. We haven't explored that much. So the more obese you are, the bigger deficit you could have, and the bigger deficit you could have, you would lose weight faster and still be able to gain muscle. If you are leaner, on the other hand, you would need a smaller deficit, a much smaller deficit. All right, so the next thing is protein. This is kind of self-explanatory. I mean, if you know anything about losing weight, you need to be increasing your protein. That is extremely important, specifically if you're going to be doing resistance training, which I'll talk about in a minute. But you're going to want to have high protein levels. Again, we can look at this like a spectrum. If we're talking about really obese, you can be a little more lax on the protein. There are several studies showing that, these people had pretty low protein, not optimal protein levels, and still gained some muscle, still had hypertrophy, even though they were, again, in a severe caloric deficit. Like, we're talking about sometimes 800 calories and only eating, I think, like 90 grams of protein or 80 grams of protein, something pretty low, and they still saw changes in their muscle mass. On the other hand, if we're talking about this side, we're talking about those more lean individuals, athletes, advanced lifters, people that have changed their body composition quite a bit over several years. Those people are going to want to consume a high level of protein, make sure that they're sticking to that optimal level, which would be, I don't know, right around like 1.1, 1.2 to 1.4 grams per pound of lean body weight. And that's based off of Eric Helms's study, which is linked in the article below, as usual. So you're going to want to keep your protein high, especially the leaner you are and the more advanced you are. You're going to want to consistently be hitting high protein numbers. And the third tidbit is resistance training. Of course you're going to want to be doing resistance training. Almost every study that I looked at had a group of just dieters and resistance training plus dieting. And it's not much of a shock that the people who just dieted ended up losing muscle mass as well. Because if you're not giving a stimulus to the body, there's no point in keeping that muscle mass. Even if you were in a hypercaloric state, it would still probably, and you'd probably still end up losing some of that muscle mass if you're not using it to the intensity that it should be used. So yes, you are going to have to do some resistance training. Most of these studies did resistance training around 3 to 4 times a week. That doesn't matter. Honestly, it doesn't matter that much. You need to make sure that you have a nice, intelligent, efficient strength training program where you're constantly trying to progress and trying to move forward. That said, you just have to know about intensities, volume, you just have to equate all that stuff. I mean, you could train 2 times a week, 3 times a week, 6 times a week. It's really just how smart you are and how intelligent you're going to go about your resistance training program. But what I can tell you is you definitely, absolutely, without question, have to do a resistance training program along with a high protein diet. And if you are specifically lean, you would need to use a small deficit. This is the summary of the video for those of you that need a quick recap. If not, please subscribe and check out the attached article. Alright, and the summary section for you people that do not want to go through the entire video. I know I can be lengthy. This is the section for you. We went over, is it possible to gain muscle during a caloric deficit? And the answer tends towards yes. Okay, again, we can't really generalize. If we're talking about obese individuals, you can be a little more lax about your nutrition, but you will most likely, it's high probability that you will see an increase in muscle mass while you're losing body weight if you are severely overweight or obese. That is pretty clear. As far as athletes, there are a few studies coming from the same lab that have examined that, and again, they also concluded that yes, you can gain a little bit of muscle while losing body fat, but we do need more research on that subject to conclusively say with certainty that this is absolutely the case. Beginner lifters, there is very little to no research on the subject, but we can kind of assume that yes, it is also possible for beginner lifters. Also, the amount that you would gain is 1 to 2 pounds of lean body mass over a lengthy period of time, so many months. You could assume that you would get 1 to 2 pounds in ideal conditions. Typically, more if you're severely overweight or obese. If you're lean, you're probably looking at closer to like half a pound. So you're not going to be gaining a massive amount. The ways you can ensure that this all happens for you is if you are leaner, you're going to want to keep a very small calorie deficit. So we're talking about like 0.7% of your body weight, a drop of 0.7% of your body weight, or if you don't want to calculate that out, like a pound a week, something like that, something small, even half a pound a week. That would probably ensure that you could put yourself in the best position. Another thing is, of course, keeping your protein really high. You want to keep your protein, if you're lean, around 1.1, 1.2 grams per pound of lean body weight to about 1.4 grams per pound of lean body weight based on Eric Helms's study, again, linked in the article below. And you will also want to absolutely make sure that you are doing some form of progressive overload resistance training. And that's it. That's the video. That's all I've got to say. If you'd like to actually check out some of these studies, then of course please check out the article below, or when the screen blacks out, it will pop up on the screen as well. If you found the information useful and if you'd like to know more, please, please, please subscribe to my channel. I am working my ass off to make these articles and make these videos as high quality and as accurate as possible. So, I will catch you in the next video. Peace!